We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters, brought to you by AJ Bell. Hello and welcome to the Money Matters podcast. I'm Laura Suter.
And I'm Danny Hewson. And before we get started on this episode, we thought we'd just take a moment to talk about why we launched this podcast, Laura.
Yeah, so we've known for a long time that there's a big gap between what men and women invest.
Yeah, and it's just exacerbated by the fact that, of course, most women tend to live longer than men.
Exactly. And it's not a lack of willingness, because if we look at savings accounts, women are as likely to have a savings account as men, but they're just investing less and not putting as much in it.
And there are a whole host of reasons for the gap, from lower pay to career breaks for things like having a baby, fear and embarrassment as well. And we're going to try and talk about as many of those as we can right here on this podcast. And we don't just want you to listen. We really want you to get involved in the conversation as well, to ask questions, to really be part of it.
And so each week we're also going to talk to real people like us, talking about their actual problems. So we thought we'd start by chatting to some women who've taken the plunge with investing.
I don't think that you need to worry. I think everyone thinks that investing is a bit like Wolf of Wall Street and you're going to put loads of money into stocks and shares and there's loads of risk. Of course, it's important to understand that there is some risk, but you don't need to put in thousands of pounds.
That was Dee, and we've been finding out what she and two other first-time investors thought about starting their finance journeys.
And we've also been talking to a woman who's made her career out of the finance industry.
For me, it really matters at this stage that we women overcome any natural reticence we have and at least start taking little steps, okay, don't know much about it. Let's go on a website, let's explore, different options to help me save more and make more of what I already earn. So I don't perhaps have to work so long in the future, or I can feel more relaxed about my financial future.
That was Baroness Helena Morrissey, AJ Bell's chair, and the woman spearheading our Money Matters campaign, really to help more women get to grips with their money.
And she talked to me about all manner of things. So what it was like to work in finance in what is a very man's world, how women generally don't like to be sold to, but also exploring some of those differences between why men and women invest in different ways, save in different ways, and really exploring why that gender gap exists.
Yeah, it's really going to be interesting to explore some of those differences. But before we hear from Helena, we're going to hear from Dee Hill, Katrina Ramamurthy and Georgia Dennison, all women who, as we say, have just started out on their investing journeys. And they might just give you a little bit of confidence to start yours. Dee, I'm going to start with you and just, why did you start investing in the first place? And how nervous were you when you first took that step?
Yeah, so the reason I started investing is because I was leaving the military and we were looking at our pensions. And I realised that I had very little control over my finances and what I was doing with my money. So I started looking at sort of alternate routes to pensions, which is when I then saw something advertised about 4 years ago called the LISA. And I went on Martin Lewis, I think money.com, and I read all about it. And then for about a year, I just kept my ear to the ground. I just wanted to find out more about it. I wanted to make sure I was doing the right thing. I think I was nervous, actually, about investing. I think that the words like stocks and shares kind of threw me off a little bit, actually. And then, so when I then put my notice in to leave the military, it got a bit more serious. And I started looking a little bit more seriously as well into how I could make my money work for me. And that is when I decided to take the plunge and open the Life ISA, which by the time I decided to do that was a lot more established and a lot more reliable, I think, from a bit more time spent on it. Yeah.
Katrina, I know for you, risk was a factor when you first started investing because you had to have money that you could invest for a start, but also you were nervous about what might happen to that money. You couldn't afford to lose it.
Yeah, so obviously, because of not knowing anything about investing, I didn't know where my money is going to be, how can I get it back if there's an emergency, for example. So that way it was a risk. But then obviously, because I was surrounded people who were using AJ Bell and earn in a different level of money and invest in different level of money, I kind of like the stress went away when they just said like go with these safe ones. And yeah, after that, I think my stress level went a bit lower.
And Georgia, for you, when you first started looking at investing, you had a number of conversations and a bit of advice.
Yeah, so I was really lucky in a previous job that they had a financial advisor as like a perk of the job, and it's I'd never spoken to a financial advisor before, and kind of similar to Dee when you were saying you were looking into your pensions, I'd kind of got to a place where I was happy with my pensions. I'd found out about all of that, so I was speaking to the financial advisor about where can I put my money now that's a bit better than some terrible interest rate. I'd just ended a 5% interest rate savings account, and I was looking for a few more options. So it was really him and his advice that kind of steered me towards AJ Bell and kind of onto the favourites funds as a kind of option. For my investing and saving my money in that way instead.
And when you were looking at those favourite funds, I know that ethical investing, and an opportunity to put your money into companies that were doing good, particularly for the planet, was a big thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think at first when the first time I looked at the favourites funds, I was kind of just dipping my toe in the water and kind of getting a sense for how it worked. So I invested obviously a small amount. It's still quite a small amount relatively, I'm sure. But, got to grips with what all the different words meant, what AC meant on the end of something, all the kind of basics like that. And then now I've been able to kind of use that information to make more ethical decisions about where I put my money in. And like you say, Danny, decide, for the best options for me and that fit my values as well.
And yeah, Dee, for you, in terms of when you started, it was quite an emotional decision to put your money into companies that were doing good things for the planet. And maybe if that conversation hadn't been being had and that information hadn't have been there, your decision might have been different.
Yeah, definitely. So when I first started investing, it was very much, I just, a bit like Georgia said, I dipped my toe in the water. I was just happy to give it a go and just see if it was for me. But then towards, sort of as I got a bit more experience, it very much became a conscious decision of what company I invested in and any organisations that I would like to support. So I then started having chats with my friends about companies that we could potentially invest in together. I started looking at startups. I started reading the organization's green policies before I invested. Very, very serious. And it actually did become a very emotional decision, and it still is. And now I will only invest in a company that I believe will do good for the planet or will at least have a green initiative.
And do you think that's different to how your male friends operate?
Very much so, yeah. So I've got a small circle of friends that invest. Some are female, some are male. Most of my female friends only invest in companies that they believe in. And most of my male friends, in fact, I think maybe all of them, invest into the company they believe will get the most money or most reward in return. They very rarely look at the company as an overall whole.
Katrina, I know when you started out, it was men who you spoke to. The only people that you found who were investing were men. And one of the barriers was you thinking maybe you didn't have enough money to invest.
Yeah, I think I've always got the understanding that to start investing, you need quite a lot of money. And therefore, I always thought that, oh, if that'll happen to me like in 10, 20 years ago when I have loads of money. But kind of like getting a bit older as well and understanding a bit better about like savings accounts just doesn't do anything. And I started to understand also that I want some kind of security in the future, that if I suddenly need money, that my money which is standing on my account would actually bring me more. And yeah.
And Georgia, now when you talk to some of your friends, you've actually got them interested. And I suppose it's those conversations, particularly between women, and women do like to hear it from their friends because it makes them feel more comfortable to take what can be quite a scary step.
Yeah, I think so. And I was, yeah, I've had some funny conversations when I've talked about the fact that I've started to invest or look into that. I don't come from a very investing-y background, like none of my friends do. And one of my work colleagues called me a disaster capitalist because I invested. And I was like, well, that's a very broad brush you've taken there. So there was a lot of different perceptions and assumption of what investing was. And when I started, like you say, Danny, and talked to some of my female friends about where they were putting their money, and there was this kind of real attachment to putting it in the bank and trusting it in the bank with the bank account that you've had since you were, since your parents set you up a bank account when you were little, and you had the little checking in book, and I think there's a kind of safety in that for people.
Katrina, what do you think would have made things easier for you? What do you think would have maybe got you investing earlier?
I think if it would be just clear that you don't need a lot of money, and B, that it would be easier. Because in my head, I thought there will be paperwork, different kind of bank accounts, the knowledge, and you just need all sorts of things. If I would have known much earlier than there's an app that I can just do like few clicks, I would definitely start it probably even 5, 7 years ago. So yeah, if everything would have made much more clear and kind of like explain that even normal people can do that. You don't have to be Elon Musk to be able to invest.
And Dee, if you were to say one thing to women listening who have never invested and maybe they're listening to this thinking, oh, okay, maybe, what would it be? What would you say to them? What would be your advice?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say, I would say that if I was speaking to, for example, as I have with my female friends, that why wouldn't you give it a go? I don't think that you need to worry. I think everyone thinks that investing is a bit like Wolf of Wall Street, and you're going to put loads of money into stocks and shares, and there's loads of risk. Of course, it's important to understand that there is some risk, but you don't need to put in thousands of pounds. It can act as a really good buffer for you. And especially with the LISA, it's that money that you can't take out. So I think that's something that I always think is that when I have a savings account, if something goes wrong, I dip in and out of that savings account. And actually, investing in stocks and shares just gives your money more security. So it goes into the account and you can't really access it, or it's very difficult to. And it's money that you know is for your future rather than for in a month or two. And I would say that investing anything at all is worth a go, and see how you get on. And I would also advise them not to watch it, not to worry about it, put it in and just leave it and let it work its magic, because I think that's something else that is a barrier for people.
So that was Dee, Katrina and Georgia all talking about how they started out and how they invested. And now we're going to hear from someone who's made her career out of finance, but also has championed women in the industry. But more broadly as well, she's worked on projects to boost board diversity and to encourage diversity of all kinds, not just gender. And she is an amazing figure in the industry that is still very male dominated. So let's hear from her now. So why did you decide to get into the finance industry? I imagine it was even more male dominated when you started out than it is now.
It was, Laura. To be honest, it was a bit of an accident. I was studying philosophy at university, not an obvious path to a finance career. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do, actually. And I tried doing law. I was at Cambridge and they did what's called a long vac term where you could take a subject like law for 6 weeks and see if it suited you. It did not suit me. And so that was no good. So friends of mine, mainly male friends, actually said, look, you like numbers, you like talking to people, as it will be obvious through this podcast, but you should apply for the city because we think you'd be good at it. And so it was with some encouragement from male colleagues, really male friends, that I threw my hat in the ring, as it were, and applied to a couple of roles. And I mean, this was the graduate training program, and they were taking on quite a few graduates in those days. And I was interviewed, I remember it absolutely vividly, by being interviewed by a man and a woman for a role at Schroders as part of their graduate training program. And I, of course, didn't realise that was very unusual, that there would be a woman in the mix. And she seemed so inspiring and really enjoyed what she was doing. She was actually in venture capital. I saw her actually a couple of years ago, which was funny, and told her she was the reason why I've ended up in the city. So it was quite accidental, but actually I discovered... I got given quite a few opportunities early on, and I discovered, I think in life generally, if you're enjoying what you're doing, it tends to help you be better at it than if you hate it. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the range of things. I enjoyed the fact that markets are so unpredictable. I enjoyed working with bright people, but I was quite lonely as a woman.
Yeah, so how did you find those, I guess, what challenges did you find being among a smaller number of women then, and how did you kind of overcome them?
Well, in the first couple of years, I must admit, I got lulled into a false sense of security because I went off to New York. Schroders sent me as a sole graduate trainee to New York, where they wanted me to learn about fixed income bonds. And the office was very small in New York and actually quite a lot of women in it. And two of the most senior people were women, and they seemed very glamorous and very sort of, in control of their own destiny. Then I came back to London 2 years later, and I found myself the only woman in a team of 16. And it was a big difference. And that was a time as well when I just got married, soon after I had my first child. And when I came back from my maternity leave, which I took about 5 months for my first child, I was passed over for promotion. And when I asked my male boss, what areas of my performance did I need to improve, he said, oh, no, there's no doubt over your performance, but there is some doubt over your commitment with the baby.
Oh, wow.
Now, this was a long time ago, I hasten to add, and the place is very different now. And that was, I don't think, particularly unusual at the time, but I wasn't expecting that. That was completely a shock to me. And of course, initially I was sort of wanting to quit, frankly. But I needed to work. It was a time when interest rates were rising. I mean, now we're talking about rising interest rates, but then they were like at 15%. It was a very big burden if you had a mortgage. And I needed to work. And in lots of ways, even though it was a very painful experience at the time, sort of realizing that my gender could hold me back, I'm grateful for it because it made me sort of really redouble my efforts and try to, I suppose, take control over my own career and strategize a bit better. I'd been working probably the longest hours and felt I was doing really well at my job, but that wasn't good enough, and I had to think differently.
And so obviously that story is quite shocking and maybe is a bit of its time, but I think we still hear some things like that now. So do you think, particularly the finance industry, do you think it has changed that much since then? And what more is there to do, I guess?
So there would definitely be nothing as overt as that now. Obviously, it's now illegal and, to discriminate someone for having a child and so forth. But there is, even though people won't say it, I think there's sometimes, as you're intimating, they will think it. And I think the finance industry has changed a lot in the last 5 years. I mean, I think after the financial crisis, there was one wave of change and sort of reflection and soul-searching a little bit. But it quickly, as things went back to normal, markets rose again and everything seemed to come back from the brink of disaster, then it kind of went back to normal. But in the last 5 years, I think there's been a realization that if we want to thrive in the future, if we want to continue to attract really bright people, men, women, lots of diversity in lots of different dimensions, then we need to think again about our culture and really consciously reach out to attract more women, more people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, more ethnic minority people, reflect society better and the customers that we serve. So it's a work in progress. I chair something called the Diversity Project, which is trying to improve diversity in all dimensions in the investment and savings industry. And I go from 1 minute of feeling like there's so much commitment, change is about to happen, and then the next minute there's another bit of data that shows that the numbers of female fund managers have fallen, in the last few years. So it's not going in a straight line, but the commitment is there, I believe.
And so this male-dominated industry has a direct impact on the number of women outside of the industry, kind of normal investors that feel like investing is for them. So I guess it would be interesting, how did you start out in your investing journey? What prompted you to start investing? Was it because you already worked in finance, or did it predate that?
Well, it wasn't really. Actually, it was afterwards. And I think like a lot of other women, there's studies on this that back this up. It's not just my sort of perception of it, that actually we tend to invest for slightly different reasons than men on average. And it tends to be less about making money for its own sake and more about achieving a goal in our lives. So it might be, buying a house or a flat. It might be, paying for childcare or having some financial security, looking forward a few years and so forth. So there tends to be a very specific motivation. And for me, to be honest, even though I worked in financial markets, the first investments were in property because I needed to, buy a flat to start with. And it was very, very practical. But of course, it's a very financial transaction, buying property and, not just what mortgage you take out, but also, what happens to property prices. And everyone had their bit of advice. And so that was the start. And then, of course, once you've secured that, perhaps, then you think, well, then I did start thinking, well, what are these ISAs and, individual savings accounts that might give you some tax benefits and so forth. And gradually got into more personal investing. But in all honesty, Laura, at the start of my career and for many years, really at the beginning, I had very little money left over because I had my children, or started to have my children quite young, always a bit sort of one step behind in terms of my earnings up until really my 30s. And then I realized, my mid-30s, actually, my pension was growing quite nicely and I needed to sort of start thinking about providing longer term for my family and, how long I was going to work and so forth. So that was when I really started to get more involved in investing in stock markets and thinking about my money growing as well as being tax efficient about it.
And so obviously the data shows and our own research shows that women are less likely to invest than men, but also where they do save, whether that's in cash or investments, they're saving less each month. So we've spoken a bit about it being a male-dominated industry and maybe that not appealing so much to women. But what are the other reasons that you think women aren't investing? I feel like we could probably talk about this for hours, but
probably. So I don't think there's a single answer, but I do think that one of the main reasons is we have a very ambivalent relationship with money. We're embarrassed to talk about it. We don't really. We'll talk about politics or work, fashion, families. Lots of things in our lives. Parties. Lots of things are more exciting, it seems, than money. We like to have money, partly for security, but also, it's nice to be able to spend money on things. But getting there is, I think, one of those slightly embarrassing subjects for lots of women. And I think we need to socialize it more. I think we need to start realizing that if we don't talk about something, we don't tend to do something about it. We tend to sort of push it out of our minds. And a lot of women, I'm afraid, do delegate their financial matters to their male partner. But that leaves us exposed, if we get, if we split up or, something else happens and we suddenly realize we don't know, where our pension, where is it invested or how much money there is in our property or anything like that. So for me, it really matters at this stage that we women overcome any natural reticence we have and at least start taking little steps, okay, don't know much about it. Let's go on a website, let's explore, different options to help me save more and make more of what I already earn. so I don't perhaps have to work so long in the future, or I can feel more relaxed about my financial future.
Yeah, because the end goal of that is great. Everyone would want to cut a few years off their working life or have a bit more money.
Yeah.
But you're right, we just don't talk about how to get there necessarily or get started on that. But obviously we both work for a big financial services company. So what more can big firms like AJ Bell and others do to encourage more women to invest?
So, I mean, clearly the mission of AJ Bell is to help people invest. And I think the big word is help, because often it seems as if we're being sold to. I think, again, women, hard to generalize about everybody, but I know I certainly don't like it if someone is overtly selling to me. I don't like being patronized to. I don't like sort of people, assuming that I won't ask, or putting me in a position where I don't feel I can ask the question that's on my mind. I think women are very smart and don't want to invest if they don't understand what's being proposed. So I think talking in a very sort of jargon-free way, just having lots of resources. So again, so many women have asked me over so many years, where can I find out about how to get started investing? So having just a very clear, it's not salesy, it's not trying to persuade people to do something specifically, but actually just explore ways to get started investing and realize that you don't have to be wealthy. In fact, anyone can invest. You can, start with a few pounds. And just nowadays, there are different mechanisms. You don't have to sort of have tens of thousands of pounds, for example. So just providing those resources, being here to help.
And you talked about kind of making money more a part of the conversation and it being discussed alongside other things. How do we, not just as a company, but as a society, how do we do that? Because that feels like quite a big leap. People are much more likely to, I think there's some great stats about people are more likely to talk about their sex life than they are about how much they earn or money.
Exactly,
which is kind of baffling.
It is a bit strange, isn't it? So I think we just have to keep having these conversations like the one you're having with me. I think we need to showcase, women of all sort of financial capabilities, as it were. I think it's great to talk in schools and universities to try. I've got lots of children and I'm very conscious that they have different aptitudes and interest levels in money. But obviously teaching the basics, helping women to feel that they can empower their own daughters and sons, with having the financial literacy. So I just think, we'll just have to keep talking and hopefully not make it seem boring, and perhaps show as well what it can do for your lives, illustrate more. I think we've embraced this with health. I think I was looking, I wrote a chapter on women, money and power and how it's so important to gender equality that we have more power around money in my first book. And in that, I came across an example where apparently police used to stop people jogging in the street in the 1950s because it was such a weird thing to do. And now, of course, everybody, or lots of people, we're all conscious at least of the need to take exercise, even if we don't get around to it. And I think money, just having it as a sort of financial well-being, like you look after your diet or your career or your children, or just doing a little bit and getting to that point once you've got your interest peaked, hopefully. First thing, to have normal conversations, real people, different levels of expertise, offer the tools so people can navigate and decide what works for them, and then just get into this regular habit.
And so are your children interested in investing? Have you got them to start investing?
As I said, I have the whole range. I have, one who wants to sort of, get into cryptocurrency and is really, diligently looking at different specific companies and arguing that he should have an investment account, and he's too young, I think. Although I don't want to discourage him, so I think it's good. So I've said, have a paper one. That was going to come back to haunt me if he makes lots of money on paper, but not in real life. Right the way through to those that obviously think money grows on trees, so... you have to kind of meet people where they are in life. I always think if you're going to try to encourage them, and this is obviously because it's good, for my children to learn how to, not have debts, or at least manage their budget, learn how to manage their money. So we try to make it a conversation from time to time, but I can't impose, I can't say, let's talk about, the stock market and what it did today. It has to be natural. So my youngest, for example, is... she gets an allowance and has one of these, Go Henry cards that means that you can be, she's 12, she can pay, for her own drinks when she's out shopping with a friend or coming home from school, little treats. But she can only buy one a week because that's her allowance, So it gets her negotiating with me and talking about, and then she wants to buy something, we talk about, well, she could save up what's left out of her allowance once she's had one of her treats each week. And so that way, even if it's not a hard, sell, it's not a really in-depth conversation about financial products, it is getting her into the mindset of saving and thinking about what she wants to buy that might take a little bit of patience.
And so for women thinking about kind of starting out and making that first step into investing, what would be your best advice that you've learned, either from your career or more just from your personal investing journey?
So, well, first of all, everybody, I think, has their own knowledge about what works best for them in terms of how they learn. So some people love listening to podcasts, other people love reading books, whatever it is that works for you in terms of learning something. Then just set aside some time, I'd say at least each month. I mean, if you get to have at the start, maybe each week, Sunday afternoon, I'm going to spend an hour just on money matters. I'm going to just look up things that, would help me to feel comfortable about money, and perhaps I've got no knowledge about where my pension is at the moment. Let's just set aside, start with some goals, set some time, not in a huge amount. Don't say I'm going to spend a week doing this, because it will kill you. But, just do something that makes it gradual. Take those steps. It's not a leap. And as you get comfortable, look at resources like, I'm going to obviously advertise here, AJ Bell, once we've got that all in the website, ask your friends, talk to your friends talk to people who might be a little bit more senior than you about, what do they do in terms of their saving and investments, and just get familiar with the concepts, get comfortable with it before you do anything actually that involves sort of parting with your savings. And just think about what you could perhaps, just try and understand, how much more you could have in the long term if you start, investing and saving now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Laura. Thanks for having me on.
Baroness Helena Morrissey, as we say, AJ Bell's chair, and she's had such an incredible career, Laura, and it was really brilliant to hear how optimistic she is about the changes that have happened in the finance industry and about those differences in the way that men and women really think about money, react to money, and think about investing. And it does matter. It really does matter whether or not we see women in the finance industry, because of course, if you're thinking about finance, you're looking at the people who are working within that industry. And when you're having conversations among your friends, maybe among your kids, to be able to see women working in that sector is massively important. And it's important because they also then understand how women and girls interact with the finance industry.
Yeah, and we really hope that whether it's the discussions with the first-time investors taking their first steps, or with someone who has obviously been in the finance industry and speaking about her own personal investing journey, we really hope that those have prompted you to either start conversations with friends or family or sparked ideas within you. And if there's any thoughts that you had or any comments, things you want to cover in the future, anything, then do please get in touch. You can email us, you can comment where you see this podcast, or we're also on social media as well. And we really want to open the conversation about money. So please don't be afraid to ask questions, however silly you think they might be.
Yeah, there are no silly questions here, and we will do our best to try and find you answers, probably not from us, but certainly from some other women and men as well who work in the sector, who has experiences of the sector, or maybe just like the 3 first-time investors we spoke to earlier, are just normal people talking about money, because talking about money is one of the first steps. So if you enjoyed this podcast, do subscribe. We're going to try and get one to you every 2 weeks. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks a lot.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you whether certain investments are suitable or not. And don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that tax rules apply, and that the way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.